When a narcissist realizes you have truly stopped caring, they rarely leave with dignity or acceptance. Instead, they often react in dramatic and unpredictable ways. Curious, internally, their sense of control begins to crumble, and that's when they reach for the most calculated tactic they have. The danger is that this last move almost never looks like manipulation. It can appear as personal growth, heartfelt regret, overwhelming affection, or even an unexpected emergency that seems to demand your attention. Beneath the surface, however, the intention is often very different. Recognizing this pattern can protect you from months or even years of emotional confusion and pain. If this message resonates with you, take a moment to like this video so it can reach others who may need to recognize these behaviors. Thoughtful. I'd also love to hear your experience in the comments. Have you ever watched someone completely change their personality the moment they realized they were losing control over you? The moment a narcissist senses that they no longer have emotional influence over you, something shifts inside them. This reaction isn't driven by genuine love, longing, or a desire to reconnect in a healthy way. It's driven by the realization that they're losing the control they believed would always belong to them. Their sense of stability often depends on emotional dominance. It's never just about receiving attention. What truly feeds them are your emotional reactions, your frustration, your explanations, your anxiety, your attempts to defend yourself, and your endless efforts to make things right. Every emotional response reminds them they still have influence over your life. When you stop responding, stop chasing answers, and quietly remove yourself from the emotional chaos, they experience it as a serious blow to their ego. They never imagined you would become emotionally unavailable. In their mind, you would always care, always respond, and always remain vulnerable to guilt, fear, or hope. Once that emotional connection is broken, they suddenly feel exposed. Without control, they feel insignificant. And feeling insignificant threatens the very identity they've worked so hard to protect. Your indifference sends a message they struggle to accept. It tells them they are no longer the center of your emotional world. It tells them their manipulation has stopped working. It proves they no longer have the power to affect you the way they once did. That is why their behavior becomes so inconsistent. One moment they may seem furious, the next they appear desperate. They may disappear completely, only to suddenly return with apologies, affection, or even revenge. None of these reactions are random. They're searching for anything that can make you feel emotionally connected again. Whether that emotion is love, anger, sadness, or guilt doesn't matter. As long as you're reacting, they still have access to you. What they cannot control is genuine emotional detachment. They can exploit guilt, confusion, empathy, hope, or self-doubt, but they have no strategy for someone who remains calm, emotionally grounded, and no longer seeks validation or closure from them. The moment you stop explaining yourself, their familiar script stops working. The moment you no longer need them to admit what happened or provide answers, they lose the ability to shape the story. That quiet emotional distance is often the point where they realize their influence is disappearing, and that's when panic begins to take over. Their final tactic is especially dangerous because it appears just as you're becoming emotionally stronger. As you begin thinking clearly, rebuilding healthy boundaries, and finding stability again, they can often sense the shift. They recognize when you're no longer reacting emotionally, but making decisions from a place of clarity instead. That is exactly when they introduce their most carefully planned move. It isn't dramatic or obvious. It's subtle, deliberate, and built around everything they've learned about you. They remember what once softened your boundaries. They remember what made you question yourself. They understand the emotional wounds that kept you connected, and they use that knowledge to create just enough uncertainty to pull you back into the cycle. Sometimes it comes as an apology that sounds more sincere than anything you've heard before. Other times, it's a rare display of vulnerability you've spent years hoping to see. It may even arrive as a personal crisis that awakens your compassion, or as complete silence that makes you wonder if you've misunderstood everything. These tactics succeed because they're carefully aimed at your strongest qualities, your empathy, your loyalty, your compassion, and your desire to resolve conflict peacefully. When a narcissist realizes you're slipping away emotionally, they usually don't become healthier. They become more strategic. Instead of abandoning manipulation, they simply present it in a gentler form. The objective isn't genuine connection. The objective is to interrupt your healing, create uncertainty, and draw you back into emotional confusion where they once held the advantage. The reason this final tactic feels so convincing is because it resembles the version of them you always hoped existed. It briefly reflects the caring, accountable, or loving person you wanted to believe they could become. But beneath that appearance, the motivation often remains the same. It isn't real transformation. It isn't lasting emotional growth. It's a carefully placed invitation to step back into a cycle that benefits them. This pattern usually appears only after you've stopped reacting. Once your silence replaces arguments and your peace replaces emotional struggle, the balance changes. For the first time, they are no longer directing the emotional atmosphere. They can no longer predict your responses or influence your decisions the way they once could. Unable to understand your emotional distance, they begin cycling through different strategies to regain your attention. One of the first roles they adopt is the victim. Suddenly they're overwhelmed, misunderstood, isolated, or struggling through painful circumstances. Long emotional messages appear describing their suffering, hoping your compassion will reopen the door. If sympathy doesn't work, they often become the transformed person. They talk about therapy, personal growth, self-awareness, and changing their life. They say everything you've wanted to hear, but the timing is often too perfect, arriving only after they've realized you're finally walking away. And if kindness and vulnerability still fail to reach you, they frequently shift once more. This time they respond with criticism, anger, or accusations. They may label you as cold, selfish, uncaring, or disrespectful, hoping guilt or self-doubt will succeed where affection could not. Once those softer approaches fail, they often move to something more aggressive. They may rewrite the past, twist events to make you look responsible, or create unnecessary conflict simply to force you into responding. Their objective isn't to solve anything. They want an emotional reaction. Whether it's anger, guilt, fear, or confusion, doesn't matter. Any emotional response gives them another opportunity to regain influence over you. That's what makes this final tactic so dangerous. It arrives wrapped in unpredictability. One day they seem caring, the next they seem distant, and then suddenly they appear desperate. The constant uncertainty keeps you emotionally unsettled. While you may feel confused, they usually are not. They're carefully observing which version of themselves still gets a reaction. Every shift is another experiment designed to interrupt your peace and pull you back into the familiar cycle. What you're seeing isn't evidence of lasting change, genuine love, or emotional healing. It's control, desperately trying to survive. When you stop caring, it strikes at the core of a narcissist's identity. Your emotional distance threatens them far more than arguments, emotional breakdowns, or endless confrontations ever could. As long as you were emotionally invested, even through conflict, you were still feeding their need for validation. Every explanation, apology, defense, or attempt to repair the relationship reinforced their sense of importance. Once those reactions disappear, they lose one of their strongest sources of emotional supply. That loss often leads to dramatic personality shifts. One moment they may seem unusually kind, patient, and understanding. The next they're cold, dismissive, or openly cruel. Then, without warning, they may appear deeply emotional, claiming they've finally recognized their mistakes or discovered painful truths about themselves. These rapid changes aren't random emotional swings. They're calculated attempts to discover which version of themselves can still break through your boundaries. They constantly watch your reactions, searching for any opening. They may cry and insist they can't live without you. They may suddenly accept responsibility after years of refusing to do so. They might even reveal painful childhood experiences or personal trauma, hoping your compassion overrides your judgment. If compassion doesn't reopen the door, the strategy often becomes harsher. They become critical, hostile, or emotionally cold enough to leave you questioning everything. Their goal is to create emotional confusion because confusion weakens confidence, and weakened confidence makes manipulation easier. These dramatic shifts affect people so deeply because they awaken hope and uncertainty at the same time. You begin asking yourself difficult questions. Maybe they're finally telling the truth. Maybe this time they're sincere. Maybe you're leaving just as they're ready to change. That uncertainty is exactly what they're hoping for. The constant movement between affection and hostility isn't driven by emotional instability alone. It's a deliberate process of testing your emotional limits. They're trying to discover which emotional trigger still gives them access to your life. They aren't searching for mutual understanding. They're searching for renewed influence. They aren't pursuing authentic connection. They're pursuing control. Their unpredictability becomes one of their strongest psychological tools, while your uncertainty becomes the doorway they hope will lead them back into your life. Once you recognize this pattern, everything begins to look different. Their exaggerated reactions are no longer proof of deep love or overwhelming emotion. They reveal something else entirely, the panic that comes from losing control. As they realize you're slipping beyond their reach, their behavior rarely becomes calmer. Instead, it becomes more focused and more strategic. Their objective isn't reconciliation, it's restoring the emotional imbalance where they controlled your thoughts, your reactions, and your sense of reality. What they fear most isn't necessarily losing the relationship, it's losing the influence they once had over your emotions. At this stage, their actions often become incredibly specific. They bring up shared memories, meaningful conversations, private jokes, or special moments that once made you feel emotionally connected. They understand how powerful nostalgia can be, so they use it as another way to weaken your resolve. If nostalgia fails, guilt usually becomes the next tool. They remind you of every favor they ever did, every sacrifice they claim they made, and every moment they insist they stood beside you, even if those memories are exaggerated or completely rewritten. They understand that guilt can make compassionate people question healthy boundaries. If guilt still doesn't work, they often turn toward fear. Sometimes it's direct, but more often it's subtle. They suggest they're falling apart without you. They hint that you're the only person who understands them or imply that something terrible could happen if you don't return. They quietly place responsibility for their emotional well-being onto your shoulders, despite never taking responsibility for the pain they caused you. The most dangerous part is how convincing all of this appears. It doesn't present itself as manipulation. It looks like vulnerability. It feels like urgency. It sounds like honesty. It appears to be someone reaching out in genuine emotional distress. For people who naturally care deeply, forgive easily, or feel responsible for others, that can be incredibly difficult to resist. But beneath the emotional presentation lies a simple objective. They want to interrupt your healing. They can often sense when you're becoming stronger, clearer, and more confident. They recognize when your self-worth is returning. If they don't disrupt that progress now, they know they may never regain the influence they once had. Their manipulation becomes more intense, not because they've suddenly discovered love, but because they're terrified of becoming emotionally irrelevant. The chaos they create is intentional. It's one final attempt to prevent you from leaving with your confidence, your peace, and your personal power fully restored. A narcissist often becomes most reactive the moment they realize their influence is disappearing. Your emotional detachment sends a clear signal that the old patterns no longer work. You're no longer arguing, defending yourself, explaining every decision, or trying to repair something they continue to damage. You're simply no longer emotionally available. That quiet neutrality is more threatening to them than any heated confrontation because it proves the version of you they once controlled no longer exists. Internally, this creates a deep sense of instability. Much of their identity depends on how other people respond to them, especially those they previously influenced. When your reactions disappear, they begin questioning their significance, their impact, and their ability to shape your emotional world. To them, it feels like more than rejection. It feels like humiliation. They experience themselves as ignored, replaced, and stripped of the emotional power they once believed would always belong to them. Those feelings create a level of panic they work hard to disguise behind manipulation. Your emotional detachment leaves them unsettled because they don't know how to exist without emotional intensity. They are comfortable in chaos, conflict, and constant emotional highs and lows. Peace feels unfamiliar to them. When you stop feeding that cycle, they lose their emotional footing. Instead of accepting the distance, they try to recreate the emotional environment they once controlled. They may accuse you of things that never happened, disappear without explanation, return unexpectedly, or behave as though nothing ever went wrong. Every move is another attempt to provoke a reaction. They're throwing out different emotional strategies, hoping one will reconnect you to the cycle. It's important to remember that these behaviors are not a reflection of your value. They are a reflection of their fear. Your calmness exposes the instability they've been trying to hide. Your silence shines a light on their desperation. Your emotional independence reveals just how dependent they were on your reactions, and that realization is deeply unsettling for them. This is exactly why emotional detachment becomes your greatest strength. The moment you stop providing the emotional energy they relied on, their influence begins to fade. They can no longer predict how you'll respond, and losing that predictability makes them feel powerless. They may try almost anything to regain emotional control, but once you understand the reason behind their behavior, their tactics lose much of their impact. As they realize they're losing control, their behavior often becomes even more intense and confusing. That confusion isn't accidental. It's one of the strongest psychological tools they have. When you're unsure which version of them you'll encounter, your nervous system stays alert. You become anxious, cautious, and emotionally exhausted. That heightened state makes it harder to think clearly. And that's exactly where manipulation becomes most effective. One moment they may appear deeply vulnerable, talking about painful memories, loneliness, or how they can't sleep or function without you. They appeal directly to your empathy. Then, almost without warning, they become cold, dismissive, or openly hostile. Suddenly, you're accused of being selfish, heartless, or uncaring simply because you've chosen to protect yourself. That dramatic contrast creates emotional whiplash. You begin questioning your own judgment. Maybe you misunderstood them. Maybe you were too harsh. Maybe they're finally changing. This constant emotional back and forth is designed to weaken your confidence. Narcissists understand that clear thinking strengthens boundaries, while confusion weakens them. If they can overwhelm your mind with mixed signals, you're far more likely to reopen communication simply to relieve the emotional tension. Their unpredictability also creates a false sense of urgency. You feel pressured to respond immediately, solve the problem, calm them down, or restore peace. That urgency keeps you reacting instead of reflecting. As long as you're reacting, they still have an emotional connection to you, even if it's built entirely on stress and confusion. None of these emotional swings happen by accident. They are based on what they've learned about you over time. They're closely watching to see which emotion still opens the door. Their unpredictability isn't evidence that they're emotionally lost. It's evidence that they're testing different strategies. Once you recognize that the chaos is intentional rather than spontaneous, you stop personalizing it. And once you stop taking their behavior personally, one of their strongest weapons begins to lose its power. Eventually, there comes a point where nothing works anymore. Guilt no longer reaches you. Nostalgic memories no longer soften your boundaries. Their tears, anger, threats, and sudden displays of vulnerability fail to draw you back. That's when they often reveal their final and most disturbing tactic. Instead of chasing you, they suddenly become completely indifferent. They act as though you never mattered, as though the relationship meant nothing, and as though your absence has no effect on them whatsoever. This cold detachment is rarely genuine acceptance. It's another calculated move. By pretending they never cared, they hope you'll question everything you experienced together. They want you wondering whether the relationship was ever real, whether the emotional connection existed, or whether you imagined the closeness you believed you shared. In doing this, they attempt to reverse the entire power dynamic. They want it to appear that they were the one who moved on first, that they chose to walk away, and that you're the person left behind. This rewritten version of events has very little to do with reality. It has everything to do with protecting an ego that cannot accept the truth, that you recognized the manipulation, reclaimed your peace, and left without waiting for their approval. To strengthen this new story, they may begin creating different versions of you for other people. Sometimes it's subtle, and sometimes it's obvious. They may suggest that you were the difficult one, the unstable one, or the reason the relationship failed. They might suddenly present themselves as happier than ever, completely unaffected by the breakup, hoping you'll question whether they ever cared at all. You may notice carefully chosen social media posts, vague messages, or public displays that paint them as healed, thriving, and emotionally stronger than ever. This isn't genuine confidence. It's an attempt to rebuild the image they feel slipping away. The greatest danger of this tactic is that it attacks your trust in your own reality. If they can convince you to doubt your memories, question your instincts, or second-guess your healing, They don't have to win you back immediately. They only need to create enough uncertainty for the emotional cycle to begin again. In the end, this final move has nothing to do with love, accountability, or closure. It isn't about repairing what was broken or acknowledging the truth. It's about rewriting the story so they never have to confront the one reality they fear more than anything else: that you found your freedom, reclaimed your emotional strength, and moved forward without needing their permission.